If you've ever listened to two different pianists playing exactly the same piece, you'll notice that pieces can be played in very different ways depending on who's playing it. But is there a correct way of playing a piece? Well, today we have four pianists playing exactly the same piece, and I'm going to explain exactly why they play it so differently. So let me know in the comments which one you think plays it better. Let's get into it. The piece that we're going to watch is Moonlight Sonata Movement 1, and first up is Daniel Barenboim. Now, interestingly, Daniel Barenboim is known as a bit of a Beethoven specialist. And in fact, in this series of concerts, he played all of Beethoven's sonatas back to back. And for many pianists, they are considered the recordings of the Beethoven sonatas. But interestingly, this piece has a time signature of C with a line through it, which means cut time. And this essentially means that you've got to feel two kind of beats in each of the bars. For most beginners that are learning this piece, they will play it where there's kind of like 4 beats in the bar. But the piece is also marked adagio sostenuto. So this kind of means that you've got to kind of play it in a relatively slow pace. But you can't play it at such a slow pace that you don't feel the momentum of 2 beats per bar. And I think Daniel Barenboim gets that balance just about right, and it's very difficult to do in this piece. Also, this piece is in C sharp minor, so it has that darker quality of sound to it. And in the second bar, that bass note is sinking. And I personally always like to wait slightly longer to play that note so that it feels really heavy. Then in the third bar, you have 2 major chords, so this is going to feel much brighter. And I also like the way that Daniel Barenboim plays this because he makes the music and the dynamics slightly expand so you can feel the positivity of those major chords. And then for bar 4 to 5, you're basically playing a tense chord, which feels like it resolves to here. So you want that to feel like you're landing there. And therefore, it's a good idea to kind of drag that out so the audience has to wait for the resolution, which once again, I think Daniel Barenboim does very well. Okay, next up we have Valentina Lisitsa. Yeah, so interestingly, Valentina plays this much quicker than Daniel Barenboim does, and once again, there is a perfectly good reason for that if you're trying to make it feel like there's 2 beats per bar and that it's got some momentum. I do think if you play it too quickly, then you miss the opportunity to feel the heaviness and the lightness that that bass note brings and then those major chords bring. But it does give the music more momentum, so there's no reason not to do that. It just depends whether you are prioritizing the momentum or the quality of the chords and how they feel. Okay, next up we have Mitsuko Uchida. Yeah, so I actually really like the way Mitsuko plays this. She happens to have my favorite recording of the Mozart D minor concertos, and I actually think she's an incredibly underrated player, even though she is highly rated. So she also plays this slightly quicker than Daniel Barenboim, but a lot less quick than Valentina. And I actually think so far this is kind of the best balance, because you can really hear the heaviness that she put on that second bass note. But also you heard the brightness of those major chords, and then she really waited for that resolution here, which I really like because it makes that chord at the bottom sound really heavy. Okay, next up we have Wilhelm Kempff. Wilhelm so far is the one that's kept it the most consistent, and he hasn't used any rubato at all. All of the other three players did use rubato, which is kind of the stretching of time, the pushing and pulling of the time. I think more romantic and expressive players tend to use a lot more rubato, whereas more classical players, people that play a lot of Mozart, Haydn, and even Bach, they will play in a much more measured way. I do personally think with this piece, because it is kind of the start of the Romantic period, I think if you play it without any rubato, I think you do miss the opportunity to kind of bring out some of those important features in the piece. Yeah, so one of the hardest parts about this piece, for beginners at least, is the fact that you have this melody that sits over the top of the chords in the right hand, and you've got to try and get that to sing out over the top of this chord that's going on. And then you get this chord where the melody note goes up and it changes for the first time while the left hand goes down. So it's kind of expanding outwards on the piano. And then once again, you get this chord that makes it feel like we're going to resolve. To here. Now, the interesting thing about this particular chord is that it's major. So before, we will resolve into a minor chord. This time, we'll resolve into a major chord. So it feels like we've landed somewhere kind of safe and secure. But then one of the most interesting features to me about this piece of music is that this major chord changes to a minor chord in the next bar. And that is one of the most obvious examples of a changing of feeling between major and minor. And it's almost like that positive major chord gets tainted. And this is something else that I think Daniel Barenboim does really well, which is he waits and uses a little bit of rubato for that turning of the corner from that major chord to the minor chord, so that you really feel the kind of weight of the change. It's a bit like when it's sunny outside and then suddenly the clouds come over and it starts raining. Yeah, it's really interesting because Valentina Lisitsa is kind of putting in most of the same features that Daniel Barenboim is also choosing to point out in the music, but she's just doing it kind of 20% faster. I think I myself, because I am more of a romantic player and I really like to show off the chords and the quality of the sound so that an audience can really feel it, I think Valentina's version is, for me, just a little bit too quick because you don't get to really feel those features. The bass notes don't feel as heavy because once you play it, you're already moving on to something else. But on the other hand, you are feeling that two in a bar feeling, and you also get to hear each melody note connect to the next one much more seamlessly. Yeah, I actually really do like Mitsuko's version of this so far. One of the other things about this top melody is the fact that it's actually written PP or Pianissimo, which means you've got to try and keep it relatively quiet. Now that is quite hard to do while also making it louder than the rest of the notes that you're playing in the same hand. But I think with dynamics, if you think of them less as volumes and more as sentiments, so PP being very introverted in feeling and FF being very extroverted in feeling, then you can play Pianissimo slightly more projected but keep that introverted feeling. And I think Mitsuko does that very, very well. You can hear that the melody is singing out over the top, but it still feels very, very introverted. And she also waits kind of the perfect amount of time for the resolutions and for that changing of major chord to minor chord. Wherever there is anything that you can anticipate in a piece of music, then making your audience wait for it just makes it feel so much better when you actually arrive at that thing. So interestingly, Wilhelm Kempff, once again, he is playing through this very measured, but he did manage to get a really nice change of quality between the major chord and the minor chord, even without adding too much rubato. He also manages to get that melody to really sing out, although I think it has more of a downward feeling to it, so you're kind of getting... where it feels very much like a bell or something that's dinging each time you play the key. That happens if you play with a very fast attack. So if you press the key down quickly, then you'll get that kind of sharp sound to the note, whereas if you play it slowly, then you get kind of a much more soft attack. Yeah, so this section is interesting because we're essentially changing key and there's a lot of bass notes that we're not expecting. So for example, after this E minor chord that we get a D in the left hand, which we're not expecting, and it kind of changes the color of the music. Then after that, we kind of get a change of meter. So at the beginning, we were feeling 2 beats in every bar, where you're getting kind of 2 rotations of the right hand per beat. But in this next section, we're getting a change of chord on the first, second, and third beat, which makes it feel like the music is moving much more quickly. In moments like that, you can kind of push the dynamics slightly just to make it feel like it's a bit more turbulent. And then interestingly, when you get to here, we get the exact opposite of what we had before, where it goes from minor to major this time rather than major to minor. So it's the same chord, it's a B chord, but we get B minor and then B major. Whereas before, we got E major and then E minor. So in this case, it feels like we're going from that darker feeling to that brighter feeling again. Unlike kind of slowing down to make it feel like it's turning a dark corner, in this case you want it to feel like it's opening out more. And once again, I do feel like Daniel Barenboim shows all of this very well. This is why I think his performance is kind of like the default Beethoven Sonata performance, because everything is in its place and he shows everything very, very well in the music. Yeah, so this is where I think that faster tempo does have a little bit of an advantage, because when the meter changes like that and you get kind of 3 chords in the bar one after the other, if you're playing at a faster speed, you automatically have that momentum as it falls down. So it really is a balance and a compromise between what you prioritize. Are you prioritizing the momentum of the music and kind of making everything feel like it's rolling forwards? Or are you prioritizing really showing off those chord qualities? Because when she played the B minor to the B major, it didn't feel like as significant a change as it did when Barenboim played it. Yeah, so interestingly, Mitsuko decided to kind of slow down for some of these melody notes to show those off. And for that B minor to B major, she kind of made a modest change between the qualities of sound, so you could still definitely hear the quality, but she didn't make a big deal out of it. I personally would make much more of a big deal out of it. However, that's the great thing about these kind of things in pieces of music. You really can interpret them how you want to interpret them. We're all looking at the same piece of music and seeing a minor to a major, but what does that actually mean about how you're going to play it and how that feels in the piece of music? I actually feel like this performance is slightly growing on me. I think he has the most connected melody, where you really do feel the flow of the notes in the melody going up or down, and the chords underneath are changing the colour. In music, generally, the melody is the narrative, it's the thing that you're listening to, but the chords underneath are the colour and the feeling of the music. So if you have a very clear melody, the chords underneath will tell you how to feel about that melody. And I think the quicker tempo allows for you to really connect to that melody, and you're not really noticing the chord changes in a big way. But they are there, kind of subtly changing how you feel about the melody that you're listening to. I also think his facial expressions really do represent the way that he's playing. It sounds very stoic and passive. The most important note in this particular section is that high C that he's playing, and this note clashes against the chord that's being played. The chord underneath is an E minor chord, but this is a C, and a C doesn't belong to an E minor chord. So it really clashes against the chord that's being played. And when there's tension in music, you always want to highlight that tension, especially if it's the highest melody note we've had so far. It's almost like it's crying out before it resolves to here. Now, interestingly, because we get this phrase repeated twice with this clashing note that then resolves, for the most part, it's always a good idea to do something different with it the second time because we've already heard it once. And that doesn't have to be a massive change. Usually, you either get louder or you get quieter, or you might use slightly more rubato the second time because we kind of know what we're expecting, so we want people to wait for it even longer. It sounds to me like Barenboim slightly softens off more on the second time. I would probably soften off as well, but I would probably also make it last slightly longer to make people wait for that last note even more. Valentina, in this case, she doesn't wait for that resolution really at all. I think once again she's prioritizing the forward motion of the music and the momentum, but I personally think when you have tension in a piece of music, you really want to make people wait for it, because it's so much more satisfying to listen to music when you feel that moment of clashing sound and then suddenly you feel this kind of warmth of a resolution. Mitsuko doesn't really wait for the chord either, but she definitely pulls away in terms of dynamics, and she definitely played the second time much quieter than the first time. Although I personally prefer it when people drag it out and make you wait for the resolution, I actually really like the way Mitsuko played this as well, because the way that she pulled away in terms of volume and the contrast of the two sections, I think really characterized this section of music really well. She also leaned on that real tense note, so that you felt the clashing enough that when you got this resolution, it felt nice without needing to drag out the music too much and losing that momentum. So she's balancing keeping the forward momentum of the music with showing off those kind of tension and releases really well. Yeah, so interestingly, this is the first time Wilhelm has put a little bit of rubato in there to make us wait for that tense note the second time it comes up. He by far has the clearest difference between the melody and the chord underneath. You really are listening to with this kind of rumbling underneath. I think because he has such a degree of separation between that melody and the chords, you're not really listening to the chords, you're just feeling them. And I think that means that the speed that he is playing is less affected by the rotation of those notes. So this section, I think, is characterized by two different things. Firstly, you have this note that kind of persists several times before eventually falling. And once again, it's that idea of repetition. When you repeat something, you're kind of insisting it. But then after that, you have the bass note and the melody kind of going inwards, so it feels like it's closing in. I really like how Daniel Barenboim makes those Bs at the top sound really persistent over the top of those moving chords. And I also think he really brings it down when that melody comes down and the bass notes are going up, so that it feels like a really soft resolution as we return to the idea that's at the beginning. Yeah, so interestingly, Valentina chooses not to kind of show the resolution after those insistent Bs. Once again, I feel like that is a little bit of a missed opportunity to make the audience feel something that otherwise they're not feeling. But then after that, she does bring the dynamics down as the notes close in. Once again, very nice. I think Mitsuko is the best at kind of creating space in the music and making us wait for those moments. I don't think she got quite the insistence on that B that I would prefer, and therefore when she played the A, it didn't feel like it resolved as much. But because she's so flexible with the timing and feeling those chord changes, it really shows it off anyway. And so far, I think she's had the most warm resolution at the end of this phrase. If I didn't know that that was Wilhelm Kempff playing, compared to the opening of this piece, I would be surprised that it was him playing. Because in that particular section of the music, he really did show the insistence of those Bs. He used rubato in order to show that resolution, and it really felt like it was closing in that middle part as the notes come inwards. I think maybe with Kempff's version is that it's such a stoic version of playing it that it takes a while to adjust to the way that he's presenting the piece compared to what I at least am used to. But a teacher once said to me, I don't care how you play something as long as you can justify it, and I feel like he is justifying it to me. I've got to say, out of the 4 players, I think Mitsuko Uchida's version of it is my personal favourite version, and I think that's just because she has so much rubato and kind of flexibility in the sound that she shows off everything in that piece, and you can really feel the musical story that she's telling in the piece of music. But as I said, I think Daniel Barenboim's is kind of the default. If you are ever learning a piano sonata, his versions of the sonata are kind of the versions to listen to if you're trying to just get everything in place. But then again, I think Kempff and Lisitsa both played this obviously a little bit quicker than the other two, but that momentum helps carry the melody. So I think as a listener and a player, which one you prefer will really depend on how emotional you are as a listener and a player. But let me know which one your favourite was in the comments. And if you want to see 4 different pianists playing Clair de Lune and my thoughts on that, then head on through and I will see you there.